Bună ziua, bine ați venit. So welcome back after a 2.5 year gap to the channel Books and Isolation with Dr. David. Now I'm not in isolation anymore, thank goodness, but I got plenty more books to talk about. So the aim this year, 2023, is to talk about an author or a book, one a week, and to post it. So I hope you'll find these useful and illuminating, and that they'll encourage you to read some of these authors. And the author I've chosen for today, if I can show you, is Heinrich von Kleist. Heinrich von Kleist. And you can either get this, if you don't speak German, in Penguin. There it is. The Marquise of O and Other Stories. Or if you speak German or read German, or you want to improve your German, you can read this Goldman Klassiker version of Sämtliche Erzählungen, various tales. And I'm going to talk about some of these tales, restricting myself to, I think, 3, because otherwise this will go on too long. So, who was Heinrich von Kleist? Well, as his name suggests, he was a German nobleman from a distinguished noble Prussian family. His father was a soldier, and his dates overlapped the beginning of the 19th century. So he lived from 1777 till 1811. How would I categorize him as a person or as an author? Well, I'll tell you more about him as an author than as a person, but he was certainly troubled, complicated. He was modern. You can read his stories and you wouldn't know they hadn't been written in the 20th century or the 21st century as we are now. He's existential. He's a precursor to the existential authors you may read later. He lived a very interesting life. He was commissioned into the Prussian army and was interested in all sorts of things. He was a very good musician, a good clarinetist. He was interested in maths. He resigned his commission because he couldn't take the authoritarian militarism of the Prussian army. He was anti-French, anti-Napoleon, and was imprisoned for under suspicion for being a spy for 6 months at one stage of his career by the French. He came to a sad and untimely end at the age of 34. He committed suicide with a lady called Henriette Vogel. Now, she was suffering from terminal cancer, and the Times of that period describes the final day of their life and their subsequent demise. They drank several bottles of wine, some rum, and the most shocking line in the Times is 16 cups of coffee the evening before they went to the Wannsee. And Kleist shot Henriette Vogel through the heart. It was a suicide pact. And then shot himself through the head. The bodies were found the next day by Henriette Vogel's husband. Why is Kleist modern? Why is he existential? Well, he perceived negative elements of the Enlightenment. Let's not forget that he was a contemporary of, well, the older Goethe and Schiller. In fact, Goethe put on one of Kleist's plays, Der zerbrochene Krug, but did so in a very poor production, so it didn't garner any particular favourable reviews. And Goethe probably felt a bit jealous that this young gun was stealing his thunder. So he cut off contact with Kleist and criticized him. So he saw negative elements of the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment wasn't this wonderful time of light and new ideas. He was opposed to the idealistic humanism of the Enlightenment of Goethe. He was pretty heavily influenced by some of the French works that he'd read, and I'm thinking here of Molière. His version of Amphitryon is clearly influenced, and one of his short stories, Der Findling. I'll translate these, by the way. So he wrote plays, and he wrote short stories, what we might call novellen. His longest piece of work was probably a work called Michael Kohlhaas, which is almost too long to be a novella, but explores the same themes of desperation and antisocial behavior by someone who is mistreated in his native land. His most famous works are probably Der zerbrochene Krug, The Broken Jug, which is hilarious, absolutely hilarious. There's a very good film version of it, if you can find that in German. Penthesilea, Amphitryon. And then the three works I want to talk about today are Das Erdbeben in Chile, the earthquake in Chile, Der Findling, the foundling, or the orphan, and Die Marquise von O, the Marchioness of O. These are the three short stories which share some themes in common. We'll talk about those themes. He got into financial difficulty later in his life, and this may have partially led to his suicide. He published a newspaper which had scurrilous pieces of news. Think of it as the private eye of the time, called Abendblätter. And he was getting tip-offs from the chief of police, and the Prussian government couldn't stand this, so they shut him down. And once they shut him down, he was unemployable. He tried to get employment. He tried to return to the civil service in Prussia, but he was unstable, and they wouldn't employ him. So he was rather desperate for money towards the end of his life, and this may have led to his suicide pact. What are the themes of his works? The deceptiveness of appearances. And we'll come on to this in more detail. I'm not going to do spoilers on the stories. I'm not going to ruin the stories for you, because if you want to read them, you should enjoy them to the full. I'll just do mini spoilers. The absurdity of life. The lack of certainty about anything or anyone. There's a stark difference between society and nature, and this is almost Rousseau-esque, and other features of his work echo Rousseau. I'll use the English terms, the earthquake in Chile. There's an idyllic paradise, a Garden of Eden outside the city, where a woman called Josefa breastfeeds another child who hasn't eaten for days since the Exodus. There's been a big earthquake. Now, this earthquake is reminiscent to me of the earthquake in Lisbon, I think in 1755, written about by Voltaire in Candide. The earthquake in Lisbon was seen as a punishment for the behavior of the citizens, biblical retribution being taken. And this is seen as a joke by Voltaire and also by Kleist, because terrible things happen on the steps of the church in Chile, in Santiago. when the families who've been sheltering outside the city return. There's an irony of death which happens in the church, and the way a wrong child is killed. It has its brains dashed out against a pillar. So there's this theme of the arbitrary nature of life and death, which is extremely modern, and we find this in Kleist. In Die Marquise von O, this is a different, the Marchioness of O, takes place in Italy, and the main characters are the father of the Marquise, who is a widow, a Russian count. It's a psychological drama. It's a domestic drama. We have the count, the Russian count, being presented as both angel and devil. And there are lots of images. The image of a swan being spattered with mud as the Marchioness is defiled by rape. She is raped in a castle after a siege which the Italians have lost to the Russians. So it's an absolutely fascinating and comic, slightly comic. How can you make rape comic? Well, we don't hear about the rape until later, and I suppose the comic aspects come from the fact that the Marchioness sincerely believes that she has not had sex with anyone, and yet she is pregnant. So there's only one person, I'm going to say in living memory, not our living memory, to whom this has happened. So is she somehow a representative of the Virgin Mary? We find out later. It's a fascinating tale with for Kleist, a reasonably happy ending, although a bizarre relationship between the father of the Marquise, the father-in-law, the father of the Marquise, who is apoplectic with rage that his daughter may have dishonoured the family by falling pregnant, and then his touching and rather incestuously worrying reunification with her when he forgives her. The final tale I would recommend you read is Der Findling, the Foundling, which again has echoes. The story of Piacchi, who travels to a city which it turns out has plague in northern Italy. His son, Paolo, catches the plague. And Piacchi, almost to replace him, adopts a foundling called Niccolo. Niccolo is the spitting image of Piacchi's second wife's former rescuer, Collino. Collino Niccolo, you will see the resemblance. And he's the spitting image of Collino, who appears in a portrait behind a curtain in an alcove in Piacchi's second wife's room. Well, this story ends in a dark fashion. It has echoes of Tartuffe, Le Tartuffe by Molière, with the church ready to take over Piacchi's house, having signed deeds to commandeer his home. Piacchi, this isn't a spoiler, well, I suppose it is executed at the end of the story, but refuses absolution because he wants to continue to hell, to hunt the foundling for whom he gave everything and for whom he lost everything. Kleist is an extraordinarily modern author and turned out quite a volume of work during his lifetime. If you haven't heard of him or you haven't read him, it's the German is not too difficult. They're short stories, so you'll get an idea of what's going on, and you can read it in the Penguin translation if you prefer. So my aim, as I said, this year is to do one review a week. So here's my first review. Heinrich von Kleist, Sämtliche Erzählungen. And I do hope you enjoy it. Thank you very much for watching, and see you next time.